December 1944. The bitter wind of the Ardennes forest howled through the wreckage of shattered tanks and burnt-out vehicles. Snow covered the bodies of men who had fought to the last bullet, and in the distance, the low rumble of artillery echoed like a heartbeat of war. Amid the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, one of World War II's darkest and bloodiest moments, a single man crouched beside a motionless Sherman tank, its engine dead, its crew gone, and its fate seemingly sealed. His name was Sergeant Robert "Bob" Merriman, a mechanic-turned-tank driver who refused to surrender to the impossible. While others saw a lifeless hunk of steel, Merriman saw hope, the only hope for his stranded platoon, pinned down by advancing German armor. The tank's treads were locked, its engine flooded and its ammunition nearly gone. But Bob didn't care. He had one goal: to bring this dead tank back to life, even if it cost him his own. What happened next would defy all reason. As the freezing night gave way to dawn, Merriman's desperate gamble turned into a miracle of mechanics and courage, one that would not only save his men but alter the course of the battle itself. This is the untold story of one man's ingenuity under fire, a story of grit, faith, and raw determination in the face of overwhelming odds. A story that proves war isn't always won by the strongest army, but sometimes by a single soldier who refuses to give up. The Ardennes in December 1944 was not just a battlefield, it was a frozen graveyard. The trees stood like black spears piercing the white sky, and beneath them, the land was littered with the debris of war. Charred metal, abandoned rifles, shattered helmets, the remnants of men and machines that had been caught in the fury of the German counter-offensive, now known as the Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell constantly, soft and silent, covering the horror like a shroud. But beneath that stillness there was chaos. Allied lines had been broken. German panzers were on the move again. And for the first time in months, the outcome of the war seemed uncertain. In the middle of that chaos was Sergeant Robert Merriman, a 27-year-old tank driver from Iowa, leading a small armored detachment with the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. His platoon had been advancing through the narrow forest roads near Bastogne when everything went wrong. Without warning, the fog lifted just enough to reveal movement on the ridgeline ahead, German anti-tank crews waiting in ambush. Before Merriman's men could react, the first shell screamed through the cold air and slammed into the lead Sherman. The explosion was deafening. The tank erupted in flames, and in seconds its crew was gone. Another shell followed, then another. Within moments, 3 of the 5 American tanks were burning wrecks. The survivors, Merriman's tank and one other, tried to pull back, but the road behind them had already been blocked by fallen trees and mortar craters. German infantry swarmed in from both flanks, their rifles flashing between the trees. Merriman shouted orders over the radio, but the airwaves were filled with static and desperate voices. Then silence. The last friendly tank was hit. Its turret was blown clean off. Now Merriman and his small crew were alone, stranded behind enemy lines with no reinforcements, no radio contact, and no working vehicle. The ground shook as artillery shells fell around them, tearing open the frozen earth. Smoke filled the air, choking them as they crawled toward cover. The only shelter in sight was the carcass of another Sherman tank lying half buried in snow, its gun drooping, its armor scarred, its engine long since dead. Inside, Merriman shouted, pulling his men toward it. They dove through the hatch as bullets pinged against the steel hull. Inside it was pitch dark, cold as a tomb. The smell of burnt oil and blood still lingered, a haunting reminder of the crew that had died there. Merriman switched on his flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the smoke. He could see the damage immediately. The engine compartment was open, its components frozen solid. The transmission was cracked, and the wiring had been torn apart. To anyone else it was a lost cause. But Merriman wasn't just any tank driver. Before the war he had spent years working on farm machinery back in Iowa, tractors, engines, anything that ran on fuel and willpower. To him, machines were alive. They had personality, soul. And this Sherman, though silent and broken, felt alive too, wounded maybe, but not beyond saving. His gunner, Private Lewis, shook his head. "She's gone, Sarge. There's nothing left to fix." Merriman looked at the lifeless instrument panel, then back at Lewis. "You let me worry about that," he said quietly. "If I can get her breathing again, We've got a fighting chance. That night, while the rest of his men took shifts keeping watch outside, Merriman worked in the dark. His hands trembled from the cold, but he didn't stop. Using what few tools they had left, a wrench, a screwdriver, a torn strip of wire, he began to examine the engine piece by piece. The cold metal bit into his fingers. The snow crept in through every crack of the hull. Each time a shell exploded nearby, he froze, waiting for the sound to fade, then went back to work. Hours passed. His breath came out in clouds as he muttered to himself, tightening bolts, reworking connections, tracing every line of the electrical system. He scavenged parts from the destroyed tanks outside, crawling through snow and smoke, risking sniper fire just to retrieve what he needed. A pump here, a wire there. Every small repair brought him one step closer. His crew thought he was insane. But insanity, it seemed, was their only hope. By midnight, his hands were raw and bleeding. The cold made it hard to think, but his instincts guided him. He could feel the machine, its weight, its stubbornness, its potential. Finally, he slumped back in the driver's seat, staring at the ignition switch. He whispered a short prayer, turned the key, and held his breath. Nothing, just the hollow click of failure. Outside, the Germans were getting closer. He could hear the crunch of boots on snow, the bark of orders in the distance. Merriman closed his eyes for a moment, exhausted. Then something in him snapped. He struck the dashboard with his fist, turned the key again, and this time, a spark. A cough, a deep metallic roar. The engine came alive. The noise was deafening inside the cramped hull, but to Merriman, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. The dead tank was alive again. Smoke poured from its exhaust, and the vibrations shook the snow from its sides. His men stared in disbelief as Merriman grinned, tears freezing on his face. "Get in, boys," he said. "We've got a war to finish." Outside, the German patrols froze in confusion, turning toward the noise. To them, it sounded like a tank company preparing to counterattack. They had no idea it was just one man, one mechanic who refused to surrender to the impossible. The resurrected tank rumbled to life in the darkness, a ghost reborn on the battlefield. Its battered hull groaned under its own weight as Sergeant Robert Merriman gripped the cold steel of the controls. Outside, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, glowing faintly under the light of tracer fire cutting through the trees. The forest was alive with movement, German voices, the shuffle of boots, the metallic clatter of rifles being loaded. Merriman's crew huddled close inside the tank, faces pale and eyes wide. The sudden roar of the engine had already drawn attention. There was no turning back now. Merriman pressed his hand against the trembling wall of the Sherman. "Easy, girl," he muttered under his breath. "You're running on borrowed time." The engine coughed and sputtered, but it held. Somehow this mangled wreck, a machine everyone else had given up on, was alive again. The crew stared at their sergeant as though he had performed a miracle. But Merriman wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about survival. Through the periscope he could see movement, a dozen German soldiers emerging from the trees, rifles raised, shadows flickering in the dim light. They had heard the tank start up and were closing in to investigate. Merriman knew that if they got too close, his advantage would vanish. The tank's gun wasn't fully functional. The breech mechanism was jammed, and the machine gun mounted on the turret was frozen stiff. All they had was the engine and fear, the kind of fear that could make even trained soldiers hesitate. "Lewis, get that 30 cal ready," Merriman whispered. The gunner nodded, fumbling with his gloves, slapping the feed belt into place. The machine gun groaned as it shifted, the barrel stiff with ice. Merriman took a deep breath, then threw the tank into gear. The Sherman lurched forward, its treads grinding the snow, its engine roaring louder than the wind. The Germans froze. For a moment the forest held its breath. Then the tank burst from the tree line like an iron beast, headlights flickering, its metal frame howling. Merriman gunned the engine and drove straight toward them. Snow sprayed from the tracks as the men scattered, shouting and firing wildly. Bullets pinged off the armor, harmless against the thick steel. To them it wasn't just a tank. It was the ghost of American armor coming back from the dead. Merriman didn't fire. He didn't need to. The illusion was enough. He swung the tank toward a small clearing where the Germans had set up a forward observation post. Tents, crates, and supplies lay scattered across the snow. As the Sherman thundered toward it, the German soldiers broke and ran. Merriman's crew, still stunned by what was happening, watched in disbelief as their sergeant pushed the tank to its limit, plowing through the camp like a vengeful spirit. They didn't stay long. Merriman knew that the commotion would draw attention from nearby units, especially the panzer divisions that had been sweeping through the Ardennes. If they didn't move fast, they'd be crushed by superior firepower. But he also knew something else. Noise was power. A single tank engine could sound like an entire armored column in the cold, echoing valleys of the forest. He decided to use that to his advantage. They made their way down the frozen road, engine rumbling like thunder. Merriman ordered Lewis to fire short bursts into the air every few minutes, not to hit anything, but to make the illusion complete. Somewhere in the dark, German officers were hearing reports of an American counterattack, of tanks breaking through their lines again. Fear spread faster than gunfire. Every mile they moved, they gathered more confusion. German units began to pull back, unsure of what they were facing. Some even abandoned their positions. Merriman couldn't believe it. His broken tank was doing more damage through sound and illusion than a whole platoon could have achieved with bullets. But the engine was straining. The repairs he'd made were rough, temporary. The oil was freezing, the radiator leaking. He could feel the vibrations change, a subtle shudder that told him the tank wouldn't last forever. He had to make every minute count. They reached a small ridge overlooking a German supply convoy. Trucks and half-tracks lined up along the road below, headlights dimmed, soldiers moving quietly between them. Merriman's men looked at him unsure. "What now, Sarge?" He grinned faintly. "We scare the hell out of them." He revved the engine, the roar echoing down the valley like an approaching storm. Lewis fired a burst from the machine gun, sparks flashing in the night. The convoy below erupted in chaos. Men shouted, trucks stalled, and within minutes the entire column began to retreat. Merriman watched them go, shaking his head in disbelief. 8 men, he murmured. 8 men in one half-dead tank, but the silence that followed was short-lived. The ground suddenly shook, not from his tank but from another. The distinct rumble of a German panther echoed through the forest. Merriman's blood ran cold. The sound was deep, powerful, terrifying. A real tank, one that could crush his fragile machine in a second, was closing in. The crew exchanged tense glances. They all knew the truth. If the panther spotted them, it would be over. Merriman's mind raced. The dead tank that had saved them could just as easily become their coffin. Yet he couldn't turn back now. He had started something far bigger than himself, and somehow deep inside, he knew that what he'd done tonight would echo far beyond this frozen forest. "Let's see how far she'll go," Merriman said quietly, gripping the controls again as the engine growled beneath him. "If we're going down, we'll go down fighting." The resurrected Sherman rumbled forward once more into the darkness, a defiant heartbeat in a war that refused to die. The first rays of dawn crept through the shattered treetops, revealing the scars of battle scattered across the frozen earth. Sergeant Merriman's Sherman sat half-hidden behind a rise of snow and mud, its armor still steaming from the night's desperate charge. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, sounding almost alive, like a living creature catching its breath after a brutal fight. Inside, the crew sat in silence. They were exhausted, shaken, but still alive. Against all odds, their dead tank had not only moved again, it had turned the tide in their small corner of the war, but survival had come at a cost. The radio crackled weakly with static. The antenna had been damaged, and their contact with the main unit was gone. For all they knew, they were deep in enemy territory, surrounded and alone. Outside, the snow muted every sound, but Merriman knew the quiet wouldn't last. The Germans would regroup. They would come back, and when they did, they'd come with everything they had. "Engines cooling too fast," Corporal Lewis said, his voice hoarse. "That patch job won't hold much longer. We push it again, it'll blow." Merriman wiped the frost from his goggles and stared out through the slit of the periscope. He could see faint trails of smoke rising in the distance, likely the German convoy they'd scattered the night before. They'd caused chaos, but chaos had a way of attracting attention. "Then we'll make it hold," Merriman said simply. "We didn't bring this beast back just to let her die here." He climbed out of the hatch, the cold biting into his face as he scanned the horizon. The landscape looked like something from another world. Trees reduced to splinters, the ground scarred with shell craters, everything silent and still. In the distance, the faint rumble of engines drifted through the air. Merriman's stomach tightened. German reinforcements. They were closing in faster than he'd hoped. He slid back into the turret. They're coming. Probably half a mile out. The men stiffened. Private Jackson, the loader, glanced nervously at the gun breech, still jammed from the night before. We can't fire, Sarge. What do we do when they get here? Merriman's eyes moved to the map taped to the wall. It was outdated, stained with oil and mud, but it showed one important detail, a narrow river crossing about 2 miles to the east. We move, he said finally. If we can get to that bridge before they do, we can block them in. The men didn't argue. They trusted Merriman now more than ever. He had done the impossible once, somehow brought a lifeless machine roaring back into battle, and that was enough to make them believe in him. The tank roared to life again, its patched engine coughing, grinding, but still turning. It was a sound that filled them with hope and fear. As they crawled forward through the snow, every tree, every shadow looked like a threat. The Germans would be following the trail of tracks they'd left behind. The Sherman wasn't fast, not anymore, but it was relentless. Merriman kept one eye on the compass, the other on the road ahead. The sun was climbing now, making the snow almost blinding. Then came the sound he dreaded, a low, thunderous growl that cut through the wind. A German panther. And it was close. Merriman ordered the tank to halt. Through the periscope, he spotted the shape. Massive, angular, moving across a ridge barely 300 yards away. Its turret scanned slowly from side to side, hunting. The Sherman was outgunned, outmatched, and mechanically dying. One hit from that panther would turn them all to ash. But Merriman wasn't thinking about retreat. He was thinking about deception. "Lewis," he whispered, "get that smoke ready." Within seconds, thick white smoke began pouring from the rear vents, part mechanical malfunction, part deliberate trick. To the Germans, it would look like a dying tank, a crippled enemy trying to flee. The Panther stopped, its turret adjusting. Merriman held his breath. He waited until the German gun began to lower, lining up for the kill shot. And then he floored the throttle. The Sherman lurched forward, breaking through the smoke in a roar of sound and fury. Merriman didn't have a working main gun, but he did have the element of surprise. He drove straight toward the Panther, zigzagging through the trees, the .30 caliber machine gun blazing to keep the Germans' heads down. Inside the Panther, confusion erupted. They hadn't expected an American tank to charge like that, especially one belching smoke like a dying furnace. Merriman's bold move bought precious seconds. He swung the tank hard to the right, taking cover behind a rock outcropping. The Panther fired. The shell screamed past, detonating behind them in a storm of fire and snow. "Keep moving!" Merriman shouted. The crew obeyed without hesitation. The tank clawed through the drifts, slipping and groaning but refusing to stop. Another shell exploded nearby, shaking the earth. Shrapnel tore through the outer armor, but somehow they kept going. They made it to the edge of the ridge and down toward the frozen river. Merriman didn't stop until they reached the bridge, a wooden structure coated in frost. He turned the tank sideways across it, blocking the path completely. The engine hissed, the smoke thickened, and at last the Sherman gave out. The crew sat in silence. Above them, the rumble of the Panther faded. The German tank had stopped short, unwilling to risk crossing under fire. For now, Merriman's gamble had worked. His resurrected machine had once again saved their lives, not by strength, but by daring. Merriman looked out over the river, his breath fogging in the cold. "She's done her part," he murmured, patting the steel wall beside him. "Now it's up to us." The men nodded. They had witnessed something rare, not just a machine fighting beyond its limits, but the unbreakable will of a man who refused to let defeat have the last word. Snow drifted gently over the broken bridge, half covered in the wreckage of the Sherman tank that had given its final breath to hold the line. The men crouched in the freezing wind, their breath hanging in the air like smoke. They were cold, hungry, and cut off from their unit, but alive. And that, Merriman thought, was all that mattered for now. He leaned against the side of the tank's burnt hull, feeling the warmth still radiating from the steel. It was strange. This hunk of iron, lifeless once again, felt more human than anything else around them. For a few hours, the silence held. The Germans had halted their pursuit, unsure whether the Americans were still capable of fighting. Merriman took the opportunity to regroup. He checked their ammo, low, almost gone. Food? Nearly finished. Fuel? Empty. The tank had given them everything it had. They were stranded but not beaten. "We've got two choices," he said to his men, his voice calm but resolute. "We can sit here and freeze, or we can make sure this bridge stays in our hands until help gets here." The men didn't argue. They trusted him now, completely. Over the past 24 hours, Merriman had led them through hell, and every time he'd brought them out alive. Private Jackson found a field telephone line running along the bridge and began working to splice it, hoping to send a signal back to any nearby American forces. Corporal Lewis set up a defensive position, stacking crates and broken planks into makeshift cover. The others loaded what few rounds they had into their rifles and machine gun, scanning the horizon for movement. Then, just as dusk began to fall, they heard it, the sound of treads crunching through snow. Slow, deliberate, growing louder. Merriman felt his pulse quicken. Through his binoculars, he spotted the silhouettes emerging from the tree line. A column of German infantry, supported by armored half-tracks. At least 50 men, maybe more. They were scouting the bridge, likely to secure it for a retreating force. Merriman looked at his men. "They'll expect the bridge to be abandoned. Let's give them a surprise." They took up positions in the wrecked Sherman and among the snowbanks. The Germans advanced cautiously, their weapons ready. When the first squad reached the edge of the bridge, Merriman waited just long enough for them to step into the open, and then gave the signal. The air exploded with gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off metal and wood, muzzle flashes lit up the night, and chaos ripped through the German ranks. The enemy dove for cover, shouting orders in confusion. Merriman's men fought with everything they had, using the Sherman's hull as both shield and fortress. For several minutes the bridge became a battleground, a frozen, echoing canyon of sound and fury. But the Germans were disciplined. They recovered quickly, spreading out, trying to flank the Americans. Merriman knew they couldn't hold forever. "Fall back to the tank," he shouted. The men obeyed, firing as they moved. They huddled inside the burnt-out shell of their Sherman, turning it into a bunker. The Germans pushed closer, grenades arcing through the air, smoke filling the bridge. Then through the haze came a deafening roar, the unmistakable growl of another engine. Merriman peered through the hatch and saw it. Another German tank, likely the same Panther that had chased them earlier. It was crawling toward the bridge, its turret slowly turning toward their position. For a moment, despair flickered in the men's eyes. Their own tank was dead, their weapons useless against heavy armor. But Merriman wasn't done yet. His gaze shifted to the bridge's wooden supports, weakened by the battle, cracked and sagging under the strain. And then the idea came to him, desperate, insane, but possible. "Lewis!" He shouted over the noise. "Get the last of the charges from the rear compartment." They'd carried a small stash of explosives, meant for clearing obstacles. Now it would serve a much larger purpose. Under a hail of bullets, Lewis crawled out, planted the explosives along the bridge's edge, and scrambled back to cover. Merriman waited until the Panther reached the center of the span. The perfect spot. "Now!" he roared. The explosion ripped through the night like thunder. Flames shot into the air as the bridge buckled and split in two. The Panther lurched sideways, its tracks sliding before the entire machine plunged into the icy river below. The sound was deafening, the crash of metal, the rush of water, the screams of men caught in the blast. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was gone. The Germans on the far bank retreated in panic, their momentum broken. Merriman's crew stared at the wreckage in stunned silence. They'd destroyed the bridge, and with it any hope of German reinforcements crossing the river. Merriman exhaled slowly. The explosion still echoed in his ears. Around him his men looked exhausted, hollow-eyed but alive. They had done the impossible again, not through strength, not through luck, but through sheer will and ingenuity. He looked back at the shattered Sherman, their savior, their symbol, their last defense. The tank had died twice now, each time protecting them to the very end. "She's earned her rest," Merriman murmured. The men nodded quietly. As the wind howled across the frozen river and the flames died to embers, the small group of Americans huddled together in the snow, waiting for dawn. Somewhere beyond the trees, reinforcements were coming. But for now, in that silent, broken world, Merriman and his crew had achieved something extraordinary. They had defied an army, held the line, and rewritten what courage meant in the chaos of war. When dawn finally broke, the battlefield was quiet, shrouded in a pale, ghostly mist. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of oil and gunpowder. The bridge lay in ruins, its shattered timbers jutting out of the icy water like broken bones. For Lieutenant Merriman and his men, it was the aftermath of something both horrifying and miraculous. They had survived, but the silence that followed the chaos was almost unbearable. Every sound, the creak of twisted metal, the whistle of the wind through the trees, carried the weight of what they'd just endured. Merriman climbed atop what was left of the Sherman tank. The metal was cold under his gloves, the paint scorched and flaking. He ran a hand along the hull, tracing the scars left by enemy shells. This tank, which had been written off as useless, had done the impossible. It had faced down a column of German armor, held a bridge against overwhelming odds, and taken down a panther in the process. It was no longer just a machine. It was a monument to the men who refused to surrender when logic said they should have. As the sun rose higher, the fog began to lift, revealing the full scale of destruction. German bodies lay scattered across the riverbank, their weapons frozen in their hands. A few wounded enemy soldiers moaned softly in the snow, calling for medics who would never come. Merriman's men moved cautiously among the wreckage, checking for survivors, salvaging what supplies they could find. There was no joy in their victory, only exhaustion and disbelief. Private Jackson, still trembling from the cold, approached Merriman. "Sir, what do we do now?" he asked quietly. Merriman didn't answer right away. He looked across the ruined bridge to the far bank, where the enemy had fled hours earlier. Somewhere beyond those woods, another German division was regrouping. They would learn what had happened here soon enough. "We hold until we're relieved," Merriman finally said. "If the Krauts come back, we make them think we've got a full company here. We'll scare them off again if we have to." Jackson nodded, his eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and admiration. He didn't understand how Merriman could stay so calm after everything that had happened. But that was the difference between experience and fear. Merriman had long since made peace with the idea of dying. That was why he fought so hard to live. Hours passed slowly. The men took turns on watch, eating what little rations they had left. Merriman used the downtime to write a quick report in his notebook, documenting the events in case none of them made it out alive. He described the battle, the odds, the destruction of the Panther, and how one dead Sherman had turned the tide. He didn't write about his fear, his doubts, or how close they'd come to breaking. Those things didn't belong in the record. History, he thought, would remember results, not emotions. By midday they finally heard it, the low rumble of approaching engines. At first everyone tensed, fearing the Germans had returned. But as the sound grew clearer, Merriman recognized the distinct rhythm of American half-tracks. Moments later, olive-drab vehicles emerged from the tree line, their white stars glinting faintly through the smoke. "Thank God," Lewis muttered. A group of soldiers from the 3rd Armored Division spilled out, weapons raised, scanning the area cautiously. When they saw Merriman and his men standing among the wreckage, their faces turned to disbelief. One of the newcomers, a young lieutenant, approached. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, looking around in shock. Merriman just smiled faintly. "So we held the bridge," he said. The lieutenant blinked, taking in the sight of the destroyed Panther half submerged in the river. "With this?" he said, gesturing toward the burned-out Sherman. "With her," Merriman replied quietly. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the story of the ghost Sherman, the tank that had come back from the dead, made its way through the battalion. Men who'd been hardened by years of combat still shook their heads in disbelief when they heard it. Some said it was luck, others called it madness. But among those who'd been there, who'd seen Merriman's crew stand against the odds, it became something more. The legend. That night, as reinforcements secured the area and engineers began building a new bridge, Merriman stood one last time beside his tank. Snow fell lightly over the battlefield, coating the twisted wrecks in white. He placed his hand on the Sherman's side, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. The tank had done its duty, and so had he. He turned to leave but paused, glancing back at the faint reflection of the white star painted on the tank's hull, barely visible through soot and frost. To him, it wasn't just a symbol of America anymore. It was a reminder of resilience, of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. War, Merriman thought, wasn't about numbers or machines. It was about heart, the will to fight when there was no reason left to. And that day, on a frozen bridge in the middle of nowhere, a handful of men and a broken-down Sherman had proved it beyond question. When the war finally ended, the guns fell silent. But for Lieutenant Merriman, silence was harder to live with than the noise. The months that followed were filled with long train rides, empty barracks, and memories that refused to fade. He returned home to a small town that barely recognized him. The same streets he'd walked as a young mechanic before the war now felt foreign. Kids played outside, shopkeepers smiled, and the world moved on, but Merriman couldn't. The battlefield had left its mark, and not all scars could be seen. The Sherman tank he had brought back from the dead was salvaged and sent to a repair depot in France. But word of its last stand spread far beyond the front lines. Officers called it the bridge miracle. Mechanics, soldiers, and tank crews across Europe began telling the story of how a single dead Sherman held off a German counterattack and destroyed a Panther tank in the process. Newspapers eventually picked it up, a small column buried on page 3, summarizing what they called a remarkable act of ingenuity and valor. Merriman never sought fame for it. He didn't even tell his family the full story. For him, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival and the men who made it possible. He often thought about Sergeant Lewis, Private Jackson, and the rest of his crew. Each one had played a part in something extraordinary, and yet all any of them had wanted was to make it home. Some did. Some didn't. Their names would fade from records, but in Merriman's mind they were immortal. Years later, a young officer at a military museum in Belgium contacted him. The Sherman they'd salvaged had been restored and placed on display. It bore the same dents, the same scars, and even the faint white star on its side, though now polished and gleaming under museum lights. Merriman was invited to attend the dedication ceremony. He almost didn't go. The idea of standing before that tank again felt like reopening a wound that had never quite healed. But something deep inside told him he owed it to the men who never left that bridge. When he finally stood before it decades later, he was struck by how small it seemed. In his memory, it had been massive, a towering beast of steel and fire. Now it looked almost fragile, like a relic from another age. Visitors walked past, snapping photographs, reading the plaque that told the short version of the story. On this tank, Lieutenant Harold Merriman and his crew held a vital bridge against overwhelming German forces, saving hundreds of Allied soldiers. He read it twice, then smiled faintly. It wasn't the full story, but it was enough. A young soldier approached him, not recognizing who he was. "Hell of a story, huh?" the soldier said. "Can you imagine being that crazy? Bringing a dead tank back to life just to fight again?" Merriman chuckled softly, his eyes never leaving the Sherman. "Yeah," he replied. "I can imagine." As he stood there, he could almost hear it again. The roar of the engine, the thunder of shells, the voices of his crew shouting orders inside the cramped hull. For a brief moment, it was as if time folded in on itself and he was back on that bridge in the middle of the storm, with fire and smoke all around him. Then the sound faded, and he was back in the museum, surrounded by silence and the low hum of visitors' chatter. That night, as he left the museum, Merriman paused one last time before the Sherman. He placed a hand on its cold metal, just as he had decades ago. "You did good," he whispered. "We all did." Then he turned and walked away into the night. In the years that followed, the story of Merriman's tank became a symbol, not just of courage, but of defiance. It reminded people that even when the odds are impossible, when the situation seems hopeless, ingenuity and determination can turn defeat into victory. It wasn't about having the best equipment or the biggest army. It was about having the will to fight, to keep going, even when everything falls apart. That was Merriman's true legacy. Not the medals, not the newspaper clippings, not even the restored Sherman sitting in a museum. His legacy was the lesson that courage doesn't come from strength. It comes from persistence. And in that moment on a forgotten bridge in Europe, a broken tank and a handful of men proved to the world that even in war's darkest hour, hope could be rebuilt, one spark, one wrench turn, one heartbeat at a time.